Done.
Yeah.
Okay, done.
Perfect. All right, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Valerie. I can see people dropping into our meeting now as I'm speaking. So as I said, there'll be more people that will be joining us. And what I would ask everyone to do is to mute their microphones so that we can have a little interruption. And as Valerie is managing this, if she's looking for anyone to, if you're looking for anyone to ask questions, Valerie, then obviously we will be able to unmute, or we could also use the side chat box, which you'll see where you can add any questions. So we're now in our third session. For those of you who've just joined this session tonight, we've been actually a small group of people who've been working on looking at what we can learn from our experiences from the COVID-19 impact, particularly during term 2. And we have already had 2 sessions where we've just discussed and shared how it was that we were learning, what sort of strategies we were using to evaluate or review or get feedback on the things that we've been doing in our schools. The last session when we got together, we actually had a look at what we learned from those, from that data that we collected, that information that we collected from our students, our school community, and we just shared, you know, what we were thinking around that. And then today, being our final session, we were hoping to go into what we are thinking of doing next. So we thought it was a perfect opportunity to invite Valerie into this discussion because we know, Valerie, you've been doing a lot of work globally, thought leadership that you've had for quite some time around what the future of education should be looking like, and really encouraging us to take the step to do things differently, because there is a crying need for things to be done differently. And I've had some previous privilege of working with you when we were involved in the Learning Frontiers work here in Australia all those years ago, and that was so exciting to hear from you about the thoughts and to work with you as we kind of develop those ideas. And I have to say, we're still using those ideas, so just as a bit of feedback for you. Valerie is, as many of you would know, has recently been involved in the CoLab presentation, and there was a webinar that Valerie presented as part of that. And I understand that you're currently a senior advisor for the OECD Education 2030 report, Valerie. And I know many of people who are involved in this session this afternoon are very familiar with that report and that document and that project. So I welcome you, Valerie. I welcome members of the SASPA Professional Learning Strategic Directions Group, and also the members of the Curriculum and Pedagogy Strategic Directions Group led by Penny Tranter, who you'll see on your screen as well. It's fabulous to have so many people here, and I'll hand over to you, Valerie, given that you're the host, so you can now just share with us some of your thoughts about what you've been gleaming at a global level. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane, very much indeed. And thank you, Peter, for the invitation. I'm really delighted to join in the flow of your conversation. I think what you've been doing is so terrific in this really difficult time, to find the space to come together and be reflective, because that's what's often driven out at times of, intense activity and turmoil, which God knows this certainly is. So thank you so much for the invitation. I'm going to Peter gave me a bit of a briefing as to where you're at, so I'm going to try to kind of slot into the flow of your conversation. For myself, in lockdown here, I've kind of seized the opportunity also to be reflective. As you may know, I was in Australia in February and March with the intention of delivering the Australian Learning Lecture, which was to have been on the future school. So how the gods laugh at us, but I was grateful in a sense that it was postponed, and it will happen next year in one shape or form. But I was grateful that it was postponed because for 2 reasons. One, it's important to locate thinking about the future school, I think, in the context of what everyone has learned from this lockdown and the broader consequences of it. But secondly, because I do believe, and maybe we're going to discuss this, that the pandemic has actually created a greater appetite for change. And I don't mean yet more turmoil, I mean change in our institutions. So maybe that's something that we can discuss, and therefore you know, what felt like a real disappointment and so forth at the time now feels maybe it was useful, but also it has created, because I've been locked down, I'm not anymore, by the way, the time to write the book. And I knew there was a book in it because I'd done 6 months of research around the topic. And so that's what I've been doing. In the lovely spring and summer weather, I forced myself to sit hunched here over my computer, pounding away. I hope not fruitlessly. I hope that will be coming out later in the year, but I've got a few things to say about that. Not going to get into that material today particularly, but Peter and I have been discussing potentially my working with you later next year if the circumstances allow, and if that were to be the case, that would be a terrific opportunity to share those ideas. So in any case, let me address the question that Peter suggested was helpful to focus on for our first kind of 40 minutes, and then to leave plenty of space for you to come back in, not necessarily with questions, but with your observations and your contributions. So I very much welcome those. Questions and challenges, by all means, up to you. But also, as I say, very much welcome your contributions. So you might want to have a pen at hand, because I'm going to invite you on occasion to certainly add to what I say and contribute that towards the end. And you might lose, if you're like me, you'll forget the thoughts that you had at the time. So I'm now going to share my screen, or try to. Let's see. Okay, shared. Is that okay, Peter? You got that? Yeah, good. Okay. So you've been looking at a series of questions, and where you got to, I think and hope, is thinking now, trying to draw it together. What are the possibilities for a better secondary education program in schools post-COVID-19? And I guess the question really is, do we have a consensus about what would constitute a better secondary education program? Have we got a shared view about what is good, what is better, and where we're going with all of this? And I just want to observe that, in sort of repeating what I started off with, that the leadership you're taking in coming together as a professional learning community, I can't tell you how important and how valuable I think that is, because what I've learned in this period is how leadership is the big differentiator. It's true at an institution level, it's true at a city level, and my God, it's true at a country level. And you're looking across the world now and you're seeing the difference, literally, between life and death because of the quality of leadership that has been exercised. And so for me, it sort of drove home, in a sense, the huge responsibility of leadership. I mean, we kind of always know that when you're in these positions, but at times like this, it's when leaders have to absolutely step up, and they make the huge difference for their communities in ways that when you go into our careers, perhaps you never anticipate that you'd be put in that position. So, I mean, partly I'm saying that to salute you and to recognize what this takes and how important it is, but also to emphasize for you the kind of difference that you really, really can make in your communities if you ever doubted it. Sometimes one does doubt it in these circumstances when you're, up to your neck in the weeds and all the kind of the mess of detail. And it does raise the kind of question, I think, of what sort of leadership you have offered and the kind of leadership that you want to offer in the future. I suppose the thing I'm going to be emphasizing is how that needs to be animated by your vision. And I hope that during this period, you'll be taking the opportunity really to refresh your vision and to think about the ways in which you express that in ever clearer and more compelling and more convincing ways. And those will be totally infused by your values. And I don't know about you, but again, this period of lockdown and so forth has made me profoundly reflective about the values that I hold, the ones that really matter to me. One of the things that we talked about when I was in South Australia in February and March was what people valued in leadership, and actually sheer competence you can't beat. And coming back to leadership of countries, aren't we looking at that, for all the kind of rhetorical flourishes and all the speech making and so forth. What you want from leaders is to be confident that they know what they are doing, that they are competent in the task, that they understand what is going on, both for their communities and for whatever it is, their institution or their city or their country. So competence and intelligence, I think, are vital. And, you know, if one feels not up to the task, that is very difficult. But I guess what we need to be doing is equipping ourselves with our competencies to make sure that they're relevant to the challenge. But of course, this is not a lone person task. We know the imperative of being inclusive about that, and informed by the evidence that we need to adduce with a wide lens. So the evidence is not kind of self-presenting. It's not necessarily apparent which evidence you're attending to. It has to be a wide range of forms of evidence that you bring to the piece. I see a couple of people smiling about that, so I wonder if I'm making a particularly relevant point there. And there would be all your other additions there too. For me, I would add in honesty and transparency, because one of the things that I have valued about leaders as I've observed them in action over the last couple of months is those who, frankly, one can have confidence are telling you the truth and are telling a wide truth as well. And I think that is becoming ever more critical. So I suppose, in short, I don't want to be sort of pompous about this or grandiose, but it's true that historic events can shape the convictions of a generation. And that's true for your generation as leaders, but also for the young people in your schools at the moment who are going through these historic events and having their convictions shaped as they come out of boredom, frustration, perhaps senses of isolation. They will never forget it all of their lives. And this period will shape their convictions, I think, in very profound ways. So in that context, this graph, I think, helps me to think, and maybe will help you to think about where you're at in trying to exercise that form of leadership. And this is about being in three horizons. Horizon one is the red line. And think about this going through a crisis in terms of time, and the y-axis, the vertical axis, is about the strategic fit of what you're doing. So the amount of time that you're devoting and the intensity of it in Horizon 1, the immediate recovery steps is really, really intensive. So that covered the period when you had to think about the emergency arrangements you put in place for distance learning, how people were being kept safe, what kinds of arrangements you were making within the school itself to keep, you know, everything that was keeping things safe and accounted for in those very early days. And then the post-peak transitioning, and I want to suggest that that is probably where we're at still, is where there is the scope for greatest innovation and disruption to normal business as usual. So here in England, where I'm working with a number of schools, many are now looking at this period and thinking about how approaches to blended learning can really shift the way in which they do normal business and what that allows for and what it will necessarily disrupt in their old routines. And that is time intensive, not necessarily hugely reflective, but fertile. And leaders who are using that time well are gathering the insights and the ideas of their school communities and their staff in really interesting ways. Come back to that in a moment in terms of audit and inquiry. But I guess the horizon that I want to invite you to look to is Horizon 3. Building and realizing a different future. That's not something you can do in Horizon 1 at all, and it's something that's kind of, you know, just a little bit out there in the immediate post-recovery period when there's a huge amount of busyness, there's still a huge amount of turmoil, and there's still an enormous amount to be reflected upon and thought about, and more evidence to be gathered. So Horizon 3 is about building the future you want. The pockets of that future are already in existence, of course they are, And the question is, how do you get those to grow and become the new future? So I think it makes the job doable when you start to reflect upon it in different packets of activity as a leader, that you try to understand that you're not trying to do everything at once, but that you can see out, further down the line and start to put in place arrangements that will help you realize that. What am I doing? So I can't seem to move my screen at the moment. There we go. So the next couple of slides, I just want to talk about, you've said, Jane, you've been reflecting on what you've learned, and I'm going to throw in some observations from me. I'd love you at the end of this to challenge some of these or confirm them if you think they're right, particularly interested if you think I am on the right lines, but also to add any of yours. So first of all, I want to go to the big picture, not about your own schools, but the very big picture that we've been thinking about. And the first thing that occurs to me is that futures thinking really does matter. I mean, we know some stuff, and I'll go to my third bullet point in relation to that. COVID-19, was neither unprecedented nor unpredicted. It was neither of those things. It was certainly not unprecedented. Humanity has undergone plagues and pandemics previously, which wiped out significant proportions of populations, reordered societies, and certainly impacted economies hugely. I guess what was unprecedented was our capacity to kind of stop our normal activities. Previously, when there were no cures, when the disease was not understood and impossible of being managed, people just had to sort of carry on and try to isolate themselves as best they could. Here where I am in Derbyshire was a great centre of the plague, and some of the villages here were well known for self-isolating and almost sort of committing collective suicide in order to protect other villages, because that's all that they could do. There was no hunt for vaccine, no ways of protecting themselves from the Black Death. And probably that expression, God bless you, when you say a tissue, comes from that experience of the plague, because the sneezing and people starting to have those sprays from the passages meant that people probably were contracting it. So God bless you was said because it meant you've had it, In any case, I digress. The point being that it's certainly not unprecedented in human life, but not unpredicted either, not unpredicted. And that, if you haven't seen Bill Gates's TED Talk, do catch it, 2015. He predicted it almost to the T. And there are committees around the world who were doing planning exercises for just such a pandemic, and their proposals were ignored. So not unprecedented, not unpredicted, but certain other changes are predictable. And this is why I say at the beginning, futures thinking really matters. And to attend to that futures thinking and not just say, well, maybe down the line, do we really have to think about that? Is simply unacceptable. And there are three in particular that are so clear that it is utterly irresponsible for us as societies and as educators to ignore them when we think about what we're doing. And the three are the planetary emergency. I hardly need to say that to Australians, which has not gone away, which if anything is intensifying. Tech apotheosis, and I'll call it that, the godlike emergence of technology through artificial intelligence and its capacities, and how we think about that and its impact upon us in so many ways, informing ourselves about that, being aware of its implications, not just for the curriculum, but for how we order society. It's a no-brainer, it is happening, and we have a responsibility to engage with it and not to adopt the ostrich position. And finally, humans evolution. This is a whole presentation, and so I don't have time to get into these. I'll say a little bit about them shortly. All I'm saying is that, as with COVID, these are not unpredicted. It doesn't mean to say that they are inevitable. We can never, predict with absolute certainty the future, but we can see the way the trends are going unless humans take action. So let me just put that out there. I'm going out of order here, but my second point, I suppose, is related to it, that what we learned was that life is not stable and steady state and reliably comfortable, much though we would love it to be. Sometimes the future comes and smacks us in the face, whether we like it or not. And just to say, oh, it's VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, is not enough for educators. We have to do a lot more than that. And I suppose I'm saying locate futures thinking into our broader vision for what education needs to be about. The fourth thing I think we've learned is that after the health crisis will come the economic and the social crises. And I'm so delighted for you in Australia that you have not had the same level of crisis that many other societies have had. We look with great compassion, I think, about what's going on in the US at the moment. But for sure, the economic and the social crises are profound. And I'll come back to that point shortly, I think. But equity, the gap between the rich and the poor, between the haves, the have-nots, and the privileged and the underprivileged, is both an underlying condition in the way that, diabetes or respiratory conditions, or having your immune system compromised. That was an underlying condition in the sense that it made you more susceptible to COVID. So did poverty. And it didn't need to be a health condition. So simple poverty could make you more susceptible to COVID as well. And equity is a casualty. So we know that the gap between the haves, have-nots, and the rich and the poor is ever greater as a result of COVID. So equity is actually creating a bigger problem for the poor and actually making that problem worse. There may be some other observations that you have to make. I hope so. Please do share them if you could later in the session. But I've started to conceive of the pandemic as a kind of giant X-ray machine, an X-ray machine that kind of reveals the cracks, the breaks, the fissures, the dark shadows in our societies. And here's what strikes me as what is getting revealed. Firstly, as schools, our unpreparedness really to deploy tech and to be really blended. People scrambled to do it, but my word, were we unprepared. And in doing my international work, I've been really interested to learn how some of the societies where you thought they would snap into it fast, like Singapore and Hong Kong, said absolutely not. They scrambled very quickly, but they were unprepared, and it was like a giant sort of experiment that got foisted on them in an unplanned and unprepared way. The second was it revealed the lack of knowledge and engagement between many schools and their communities. And only you will know whether that was true for you or whether actually you felt really well equipped and well informed about the state of your communities. Schools I'm working with in London, many of them were shocked when they had to have different kinds of engagements with their families to see how little was going on and could go on in some families, and the kinds of environments that kids were coming from, which principals really knew very little about and were shocked how little they knew about. And it really conditioned how they're going forward in terms of their schools. Secondly, how utterly central the social function of school is. Now, every survey has shown that what kids have missed is their friends and the interaction and the spontaneity. Who knew, really? Maybe we did. But for staff too, I mean, the Zoom's okay, but the spontaneity of conversations, the encounter of people in 3D ways, I mean, the centrality of that, I think, has been revealed to us. And how the flexibility of release from school, from the mandatory attendance, has been really, really enjoyed by some students. Not all, by any means, but an interesting number. for whom the school's routines simply did not fit. And you think particularly here of some adolescents for whom early rising and clicking into gear at 9 o'clock in the morning simply doesn't fit their physiology, really, or perhaps their tastes or their styles of learning. And so this notion that mandatory attendance in fixed periods has got to be our norm going forward, I think is something we must reconsider, because we can, I think, flex the way in which school is done in ways which will fit many students much more suitably. And it's also revealed, I think, in some schools, the levels of dependency on teachers that, you know, whilst we are aiming towards greater learner agency and greater learner independence, the levels of teacher dependence got really revealed big time during this period. And as I've already said, the scale of the equity gap for some teachers and for some principals, the X-ray revealed starkly and perhaps shockingly. It depends, of course, on your community and the way in which you have related to your community, but I know a number for whom that has been the case. It may or may not be for you. So a question for you, and maybe we can share this later, is there anything else that the X-ray machine has revealed from your circumstances that you've discussed in your previous sessions as a professional learning community? Now, I think that the SASPA questions wheel is a really great piece of work. Thank you, Peter, for sending it to me, and I've been enjoying going through it, so much so that I hope you don't mind, I've shared it with some schools here in England with full recognition and acknowledgement of your work, by the way, but I know that they will find it valuable, and they're great questions, I think. But I've noticed that what they focus on is the notion of creating expert learners with the quite correct question. It's not just what students know, it's what they can do with what they know. And I was meditating upon this and thinking about it because, you know, I think it's a great piece of work. But I suppose I want to say about it, and there's an and about this, which I want to kind of put in the picture today in the light of what I've already said. Because, why do I say this? I read a lot of history, and for reasons not very clear to me, I suppose, I've been reading about the history of the rise of the National Socialist Party, the Nazis, in Germany and Austria in the early 30s, and thinking about how it was in that society that, I mean, by the way, it of course came about as a result of a huge economic crisis. It was the economic conditions and the social crisis that led to that. I just want to tell you the story of two of the leaders of that movement amongst the Nazis. And the first was Joseph Goebbels, who, not many people know this, but he had a PhD, actually. He was an expert learner. His PhD, by the way, was in literature, romantic drama. And so not an uneducated man. And by the way, he wasn't, most people know him as the director of propaganda for the Third Reich, but actually his full title was the Director of Enlightenment and Propaganda. I always think a rather fine irony. The second I thought about was a guy called Reinhard Heydrich. Actually, he's the subject of a movie, if you don't know about it, it's very interesting. Got to be known as the man with the iron heart because he was the architect, he was the designer of the final solution. He gathered together the top Nazis and created the final solution. Now, this guy was an immensely talented musician, really, you know, sort of professional standard, a violinist who was particularly riveted by Schubert and knew Schubert's works very well. An expert learner who could demonstrate and do wonderful things. He could move people with his musicianship. I've been reading, actually the book on my decks is this one, The Rat Line, which is about how the top Nazis escaped at the end of the war, actually through the Vatican. The Rat Line was their escape route through Rome with the help of the Vatican and then out to South America. And this is about a guy called Otto Wächter, who was the governor of Poland, indicted at the end of the war for mass murder. Point about him, really very skilled lawyer. Went through law school in Austria, was thought to be, you know, going to the top of his profession, very, very smart and immensely skilled learner in jurisprudence. Why do I belabor all this? I beg you not to ignore the fact that creating expert learners is not enough. that we need to be thinking hugely holistically about the value frame within which that learning goes on. What it is that we want our learning systems, our education systems to be doing goes beyond just creating expert learners who can do stuff with what they know. The stuff that they do, what they choose to do with it, is as important. And I just feel this with every fibre of my being, that if we don't attend to that as education systems, we will not have been doing our duty, in short. And I've tried to capture that in the work that I published back in 2017, a little book called Thrive. I'm not trying to flog this book, I just need to bring this frame into the whole discussion here. It is, by the way, coming out in a second edition, but Cambridge University Press have commissioned this autumn. So if I do come back and work with you next year, it could be that the second edition is something that we might look at. But I suggested there that our explicit purpose needs to be around learning to thrive in a transforming world. And God, do we now know that our world is transforming? Futures thinking tells us that big time, okay? It's not just a few little changes here and there. It is a transforming process, which, you know, were we to be able to come back in 50 years' time, I certainly won't, maybe some of you will make it with our extending lifespans, it would be unrecognisable. Now, the point is this, that thriving is not just about the individuated business of creating expert learners. It's got to be seen in a very collective piece, and it's not all about us as humans. It's got to be about how we thrive at the planetary and global level. That is to say, how we maintain our planet in good nick as a livable home, how we thrive at the societal level. Are we equitable societies that create conditions for community thriving? Are we thriving interpersonal relationship building levels? And are we thriving as individuals, the intrapersonal level? I don't know of a better way to conceive of thriving holistically. And it's just a frame that may help you when you're thinking about your curricular choices, which I want to come on to now, to see, are we covering off all we need to as we go forward into our next third horizon? So 4 levels of thriving strike me as a critical frame in which to conceive of all this. And what I've tried to do in the book, and I offer to you as a kind of frame, again, as you look forward to the third horizon, is, are you addressing these kinds of learning goals? Let's take them in turn at the planetary and the global level. Do we need to ensure not that we just simply got, you know, lowering our energy intake, but actually our young people are coming out knowing how to protect the Earth's ecosystem, that they care about that as much as they care about their own home, because it is their home. And I tell you this, if in our schools we don't create circumstances where kids learn to love the environment through close encounter with it, they will not put themselves out to protect it. We don't place ourselves in positions where we fight for something unless we care about it, unless we love it. And will they love it unless they really encounter it in meaningful ways? And so many kids these days don't. So I think those 3 goals there under planetary and global competence are critical: living sustainably, learning to protect the Earth's ecosystem, and acquiring global competence, which is the social dimension of this, how we respect other cultures. At the societal level, I'm suggesting that we need to learn how to navigate a disrupted, uncertain landscape of work. And this is where the pieces around, I mean, this is a very much longer presentation to give to you, but this is where the impacts of technology, which by the way will be speeded up because of the COVID space. I tell you that in every single recession, which is where now we're moving into, every single recession, employers and businesses have accelerated the rate at which they automate what they do, because it drives down costs and makes them more viable businesses. And that greater automation makes even more disruptive and more difficult the employment landscape that your learners will be facing. So what they need to be doing is understand how to navigate this disrupted and uncertain landscape of work. And I also think that if we are about trying to create equitable societies, our young people need to be in a position of reinventing a different kind of way of doing democracy, a meaningful democracy, which everywhere across the world now is under threat and is fragile. Thirdly, the interpersonal level. Are we putting social and emotional learning at the core of what we do and not at the margins? Because if they are not learning to create loving and respectful relationships in highly technologized societies, societies which over the last couple of months have been kind of moderated through Zoom and through screens, you know, with what effects? Yet unknown. But putting those ways in which we develop loving relationships at the very center of learning, then we are really missing out. I'm going to speed up here because of the lack of time. But of course, at the heart of all this, in the heart of the period when we know that mental health problems have been even more exacerbated by people's feelings of isolation, the learning of a secure sense of self, of who you are, and taking responsibility for your personal health, fitness and well-being is going to be at the heart of what we do as schools. So that's the frame that I offer in ways of thinking about the curriculum as a whole and the choices that we make as educators. I hope you find that of some value, and it's something that you might like to interrogate alongside the questions that you put in the wheels that SASPA has offered, which, as I say, I think are terrific. But some broader reflections on schools and beyond. Surely now some values have shifted. Do you not agree with me there? I think so. Did the shutdown really contribute maybe to the strength of response over what's happened to George Floyd and you know, the acute awareness of the unacceptability of racial prejudice and discrimination in our societies? I'm sure it has here in Britain. I'm sure of it. People are more sensitized to that now as a result. And maybe, just maybe, there is more of an appetite for change. And maybe, just maybe, there's more of an appetite for change about what schools do too. That people are a little bit more receptive to thinking about these institutions in different ways. I hope so. Maybe the starkness of the health and the educational and the racial inequalities may now shame some societies into addressing them much more seriously. I get that sense in some areas. Again, it might come down to the quality of leadership as to whether it can be followed through. It seems to me now, as I've already remarked, that recession is forecast everywhere to different degrees. I hope for your sakes that Australia and New Zealand do find themselves in a bit of a bubble there. But still, what's going on between you and China will have an effect upon that. But the implications for employment in the coming decade and beyond it, possibly generationally, are very serious. And there's also, from your point of view as secondary principals, the impact on higher education. Its business model, its modus operandi, its relationship with its communities mean that it's really in a state of far greater turmoil even than the schools, because every institution of higher education is now looking at how it needs to change. And I think this is a huge opportunity for a much greater relationship with schools, because the reliance on foreign students, the expectation of the old lecture modality, all of these things are shifted. And so the way in which schools can relate to their universities, I hope and think will change, not least because we have entered this age of disruption, and now is the time to rethink whether we can create a much more integrated learning ecosystem rather than these, you know, separated off sectors and institutions. Think about this as living through an age of disruptions and what part we can play within moulding those disruptions to the kind of future that we want. Jane mentioned the OECD 2030 project, which some of you may know. The whole reason I got really attracted to working for that was, for the first time, education was saying, what is the future we want? And what is our role in creating that? Not just kind of doing the bidding of governments in terms of curriculum selection, but what is the future that collectively we need to create together? And in part of that, and going back to my remark about higher education, learning pathways need to be directed towards finding meaning and purpose in life. It's not about creating terrific scores in the ATAR or the HSC or whatever it is. That final end of school qualification is kind of a nonsense, really, because we just need to think about this as a seamless continuation of learning throughout life, and the learning pathways that we are in the business of trying to help learners design need to be directed towards finding meaning and purpose. What else matters? You know, what else matters, really? So the question I'm going to finish with is how we might build back better, how you might start to address this third horizon. And this has been called the Great Pause. Leaders who are in the middle of it may not feel as if they've paused, you know, it's been incredibly busy, busy, busy. But there is a kind of pause, and I think it's the leadership challenge of your generation. Nothing less than that, really. How can you seize this opportunity to kind of give a shift to what's been steady state until now? And having said that, I know that in South Australia in particular, you've been doing great work in terms of trying to reorient your institutions towards the things that appear in those learning wheels that SASPA have created, towards more learner agency, towards greater engagement with communities. But now, during this point, you've got the leadership challenge of your generation. And now, have you got clear about the narrative that you need as a leader to be deploying in your community, in the community of your school, amongst your teaching staff, with your learners, and with your broader community, your parents and beyond that? Is your narrative clearer, the kind of messages that you want to convey about your enterprise? Do you agree that some values have shifted? And can we grow that, or will people just snap back, is what I'm saying? Because there will be a huge tendency to snap back, you know, bring it back to normal, people cry. Well, yeah, some things were great about normal, some things were not. And can we be opportunistic in seizing the moment when people are being more reflective about their values? And this final one, I really want to share with you, because I'm trying to write about it now, and hearing what you have to say would be really helpful. Given that we've had shown to us what can be done through online and distance learning, and started to really incorporate blended learning in much more serious ways, can we really elevate what's precious and special about being in physical face-to-face school environments, and not try and not use the time in school to do what could be done online as effectively or even more effectively? That's what Blended is about. Deploy the technology where it's really great, fine, use it. Deploy time differently so that when you're together in a school, you really are recognizing the preciousness, because now we know that it is precious, of being in face-to-face engagement with other humans. How do you make the most of that? Because in the end, you know, the people who are saying, well, really, do we need schools anymore? It shows it's the end of school, doesn't it? Because we can do it without them. Well, the hell we can, as far as I'm concerned, but only if we build back better schools which certainly deploy the technology really smartly, but also who use the time when they're together face-to-face for all the precious experiences that can make, particularly around how we build relationships, and of course aspects of the arts. You know, what's been missing too, is so important, is doing sport together, making performances together, doing the things that interacting is so central to. So I think elevating what is precious and special about physical face-to-face is really important. And what you're doing is what Meg Wheatley wrote about in some of her wonderful writing. If you don't know her writing, you might want to dig in, is being brave to have the conversations that matter. Because these conversations really, really matter right now, I think. So I, as usual, have gone on rather longer than I intended. I'm going to stop sharing right now and go back to the main screen and invite your remarks or your comments. And I say again, they don't have to be questions at all. They can just be your observations. So I can't see everybody, but I see Peter Mader putting it. Oh, are you clapping or putting your hand up? You've been clapping. Okay, thank you. Let me see if I can see anybody with their hand up. You can just wave your arms about like that if you prefer, or you can use a little sign. And please, or else just stick your microphone on so that you can come in.
Hi, Valerie. Hi, everybody.
Hi, welcome.
I'm Craig.
Hello,
Thanks
Craig. Go ahead.
Thanks for your presentation. Really appreciated the thought you put into it and connected to the work we've been doing, the thinking we've been doing. So thank you for that. I wanted to pick up on something around, you said around what got revealed. And I reckon for us here and for this group of people, what got revealed for me is the way in which the organisation in a professional organisation is ready to, willing to go out of its way to support each other, and did that in a effusive, excellent, expedient way.
Wow.
So I think that's something that contextually here that we can definitely say, and I can see other people nodding, so I hope you agree with me in speaking on behalf of you all there, because you all did it.
That's fantastic. I mean, other people have said to me during this period, you find out who your friends are. So that's true at the interpersonal level, but it also shows who rocks up to help out at the time, you know. And some professionals, I mean, in the medical profession, it's as true. My daughter's a doctor, and she's saying, so she was on the line. She is on the line still, you know. And then you find out who's really supporting you and who actually isn't. So that's a valuable piece of learning, I think. Thanks for that, Craig. Who else? Because I can't see signs very particularly. Just jump in and put your microphone on and jump in.
I'll jump in.
Jane, go.
I'm always quick. One of the things that we were talking about within our PLC conversations was how our school communities, like teachers, students, parents, really seem to come together around each other to support. And Craig's talked about as an association and as professionals we did that. But we reflected on the fact that teachers stepped up and beyond what it was that we were needing to do, and that our parents were incredibly appreciative and thankful of the work that we were doing, and our students, you know, were sending us letters of thanks and you know, realizing what we were going through. And I was doing some work that, of yours, a reading of yours around the learning ecosystems, the local learning ecosystem. And I thought this is really showing me the importance of that whole community, school as a community hub concept that we've talked about before, and giving us the chance to think about how we could take that to the next stage, like not just have it in as a consultation process, but that real co-design, that real work alongside each other for the benefit of the children and young people in our schools. So I don't know what, I haven't had a chance to really delve deeply into that work, Valerie, but it was really interesting for me to scratch the surface, I suppose. Have you got a comment or?
Yeah, no, I want to come in on that, Jane. Thanks very much for that. Actually, in talking to Peter about that, and in his briefing note to me, he suggested that I start to introduce that concept into this. Honestly, there just isn't time, and otherwise it would have been incredibly superficial. But Jane, your point is exactly right. And it does go back to some of the work that we did together all those years ago, which is reconceiving of the school as a base camp. So a learning base camp, not where all learning goes on, but where the people come together to reflect, to plan, to be strategic, and to move on to the next stage together. I think the base camp concept, which we developed when we worked together in Learning Frontiers, still holds. Another way to think about it is the school as part of an ecosystem of learning. And the ecosystem for sure incorporates your broader community, but many other kinds of institutions as well. I mean, I made the remark about higher education, and I think that increasingly higher education is going to have to see itself as part of a learning ecosystem with the schools in close proximity. That, I mean, I'm very interested in some of the ecosystems I've been studying in the States, where they have all kinds of early college programs, and, you know, kids can sit in on virtual lectures, they can take early college entrance, they deploy some of the undergraduates and indeed the postgraduates as mentors and as learning guides to young people. They deploy the professors to give, you know, expert input to some of the classes. So it's a much more merged ecosystem of learning rather than these fortresses of different institutions. But your point is about the broader community and what it can offer and what it needs to offer, and the way in which it becomes completely embedded in the efforts of the school. So on another occasion, I'd love to talk and work with you around how we develop this idea of learning ecosystems in much more profound and extended ways. I'm sorry there hasn't been an opportunity to do it today, but you're right. I think a sense of community has been part of the reveal and maybe part of the shift in values as well. I wonder if anybody's got any comments about changes in values that happened. I worry that it's just me in my little bubble thinking that this is the case, but I just do feel that what's happening with black and minority ethnic groups, that the sensitivity to it, the rage, has partly been, and I'm not quite sure what the mechanism is, but the strength of that feeling, you know, has sort of come on the back of this lockdown and the great pause. I don't know if anybody's got any comments about it. Just jump in if you do.
Yeah, Valerie, Jason here. Actually, I was going to ask you a question actually around that, because you talked about the SASPA wheel and, you know, the creating expert learners, and then you commented on the and the value frame that surrounds that. And I'm wondering if you're seeing or developing any insight into the nature of that value frame that maybe those of us that are living and working within it, we're not really aware of it because it surrounds us as well. And with the pandemic evolving as it has, and you talk about, you know, the George Floyd situation and other aspects there, are there anything that perhaps you're wondering or even concerned about that these students are going to be developing and evolving within that value frame that I guess as educators we perhaps need to be mindful of?
Yeah, well, that's why, Nathan, that's why I went from there to the notion about thriving at 4 levels, because that is completely embedded in, as it were, making clear your value frame. It says, first and foremost, we value having a livable planet. And if we don't devote all our efforts in the next 20 years to making sure that that happens, the rest is for nothing. Because I tell you, it will make, you know, what's coming down the line will make COVID a walk in the park. And you will know this, you will know this. This is the point. It's about knowing stuff and not knowing it and not putting it sort of center stage. A quick anecdote, I know we're running out of time, but I was really struck by, which book was it? It was, can't find it. There's a book called We Are the Weather by Jonathan Safran Foer, and in that, really interesting about values, he remarks on a High Court judge, on a Supreme Court judge, who in the around about 1942, a young Jewish guy escaped from the Warsaw Ghetto, and he made it through to the United States, and he said he got hold of some important jurists, and this Supreme Court judge, he told his story about what was happening to the Jews. And the judge listened to it and was very forensic and questioned him and interrogated him, and it was clear that he had all the evidence, and what he was saying about what was happening to the Jews was true. And the High Court judge, whose name I can't remember now, said at the end of it, I understand what you're saying, but I cannot accept it. And the Jew said, what? You mean you think I'm lying? You think this is untrue? He said, no, I hear it, but I cannot accept it. Now, what he was pointing to was a kind of a psychological truth, which is that some things are so big, so kind of horrifying, that the human finds it very, very hard to kind of engage with it. And I think that's where we're at with the business about our planet right now, because what is happening is so huge and so potentially catastrophic that to engage with it really kind of, you know, takes you over. Or as Naomi Klein puts it in her book, this changes everything. So I'm not avoiding your question. What I'm saying is my answer to that question about the value frame is what I've tried to sum up in the values around what do we want at our planetary level? What is it that we value at our society's level? Do we value the continuation of democracy or don't we? Because if we do, as educators, we need to start educating our young people to reinvent it, because they're disappointed with what they've got. Democracy has, for many people, not delivered what was on the tin, you know. And I'm part of serious debates amongst people now saying, oh, really, do we not think that China handled all this much more effectively than the democracies? You know, maybe actually it's really, we've been talking up democracies too much. You can have a much more effective system if you just have highly autocratic and technocratic one-party states who can get things done. So if you're actually part of debates where that is a serious point of view, we've got a problem, and it's a problem of values. So just to finish off, I suppose, my answer to your question is, for me, I've tried to capture a value frame that people can at least work within at various levels. There's going to be differences, there's going to be debates, of course there are. But my plea is, for God's sake, don't leave values out of the question. And COVID, in a sense, has given us the great pause within which we can put values back into the debate, into the conversation. What is it that we're trying to do here? You know, what really are we up to? What is a good life? And when you're in lockdown, you ask yourself that question, don't you? Yeah, what's a good life? I'm not that fussed about going to restaurants anymore. I don't know about you. I used to all the time. I think, really? Is that a good life? I know that I really, really care about my garden now. I really, really care about the environment. I'm in the Peak District, very beautiful part of the world. And my God, you know, if anybody lays their hands on it, I'll be lying down in the road, kind of thing. It's changed me. So I suppose I'm saying we must deploy these changes that have come, unwelcome though they were, of course they were. I'm not talking about silver linings from COVID, because I think they are very thin. It's a catastrophe at the first order. But at least hold on to the bits that we can work with, which is, I think, a sort of a volatility, a receptiveness about a discussion about values. Anybody else want to jump in?
Hi, it's Amanda.
Hi, Amanda.
That's interesting that you point out your changing values and give an example of your garden. I guess for us in South Australia, for me personally, I felt like I was not isolated because we were required to go back to school. We had the pleasure of enjoying 4 student-free days where I gave the staff permission to work from home for 2 of those 4 days. So when people talk about their isolation, in some ways I'm a little bit jealous because I didn't get to experience it to make those deep reflections about what is a good life. So that was one point. My second is just building on Craig's point he made, and I don't know why this happens, but my staff and our self-efficacy just came together. And I often ponder whether that's because everything, well, first of all, a lot of clutter disappeared in our jobs, and that enabled me to be much more directive with staff because I was the one assimilating all this information from different levels of the system, and from health and from education. And maybe though you've prompted me to think, well, maybe my own narrative became clearer, so that made things more seamless for others. And then I think, well, actually, was that the culture we were already building in the school? And I've been there for 9 years now, and we've had some events in the school where the staff have just come together and acted as one, and it's always been in this kind of emergency type situation. So that's a lot of my ponderings that I have no answers for, but I like reflecting on them. And this group,
well, it does just go to show how different our experiences can be. I mean, there's a certain similarity, but I had 7 weeks of isolation, and unable to see my daughters, my granddaughters, only, you know, very social distance with other people. And I've had enough of it now, really. But I wouldn't, you know, this is a strange thing. I'm glad of it. I'm glad it's that period, which, well, partly because I've written, and it is, you know, it enables you to focus. But it does enable you to think, and as you say, get the clutter out of the way a lot of the time. So it's interesting. But Amanda, do you think, as a result of your experience, you will use time differently within the school?
Oh, absolutely. Which is something we have been working towards. And I mean, the blended learning is something we've been working towards for several years now, and COVID actually escalated. So those staff who were already flourishing in that area went even further ahead. There was that, the majority of people were kind of there, but then they were forced into it, and it happened. So because of the length of time, we didn't have any resistors. It was just about making a choice. So that transition was quite smooth.
Really useful. I mean, my hope would be that the acceleration of the utilisation of blended learning isn't just for purposes of more efficiency and covering more stuff, you know, but rather that it kind of clears space within the physical coming together for different uses. And again, I would say that for many principals, the notion that social and emotional learning, the attending to, I don't want to call it well-being because well, it's a whole other story, but the sense in which we are thinking about young people's relationship making, their comfort with themselves, discussions about helping them come to terms with their own emotions and find vocabularies around their own emotions. All of those things which constitute a really rich social and emotional learning agenda need to be so much more at the core of what we're doing and not in the margins. I mean, they're kind of in all schools, but they tend to be marginalised, like a kind of nice to have. And I think that what we're learning is that they need to be really, really central, and alongside the other things that can only be done face to face, and which give such, I mean, you know, you look, there's a thing that Larry Rosenstock does, which said whenever he has people, I don't know if you know him, he's the principal of High Tech High, this year's WISE laureate. And it's a device, I think, Jane, that we used actually in Learning Frontiers as well, which is to say to a group of people, what is the most powerful learning experience that you can remember in your life as adults? So go back to your school experience. What is the most powerful learning experience you've ever had? And, you know, people sort of think about it and they delve into their memory. And like 9 out of 10, it's something where they came together with other people. It might have been a performance. It might have been, you know, a challenge in sports or something like that. It might have been a project that they did. But what they will remember and was powerful in terms of their learning, almost invariably, had those elements of collaboration and connection with other people, forming great relationships to get something done, sense of achievements at the end of it. You know, it wasn't passing this, that, or the other test, or, you know, mastering a concept. I mean, for one or two, that's the case. I mean, we're all different. But my point about it is that that is what the school offers. And I come back to what I'm writing at the moment, which is the future school. If the school as an institution has got a future, it's about optimizing that use of time when you're together in the same space for fundamentally human activity. Don't do in that time what can be done with a computer, because, you know, that we'll just get on with that. But let's maximize our time, or optimize our time together as humans in our relationship making, in the things that can only be done collectively. And I know that might be being a cricket team, it might be, all right, whatever it is, but the humanity of it, I suppose.
Can I connect with that thought? This Rogan here. I just wanted to say, because my comment was around the changing view of schools, and I think this period has been a major part of that. And as educators, we are used to seeing the richness of experience of what happens at school. But I think that for the broader society, there's a lingering narrative of children are stuck in a classroom and it's a bit impoverished, and the real world is happening outside, and they're sort of in class, they can't talk to their friends or play or connect with nature or do those other things.
Yeah.
And that class is in a way taking people away from that. What's been really clear from this period is that actually, with the way the world has changed, home is a bit of an impoverished environment where they're online, digital, they don't have the richness of experience that they can have at schools. And so I think that view that schools can provide such a variety of physical things, that with science we have equipment where they can explore their world deeper than they can at home, they're connecting with friends in new ways, that perhaps that is the beginning of that shift away from school as being seen, that taking students out of the world by putting them in the classroom is actually not a view that we have anymore.
Well, two things about that. One, and it relates back to Jane's point about ecosystems and schools really being in the real world and utilising all that's around them. In the very best of schools, of course, do that big time. You use the museum or the theatre or the national park or whatever it is as the classroom, you know. And the old caricature, as you said, kids being locked up in classrooms, let us hope that that becomes more and more outdated. But we have to work at that. I mean, it's not easy to sustain, to organise and sustain. And the schools who do it really well put people on it. I mean, talking about use of time, then the schools who do it really well have people who are committed to making that all work really well. Take, for example, the organisation of internships, and talk about, you know, connection with the real world. Any big picture school that's got a huge variety of internships, that needs organisation. That needs not just to be done on the side. So you have to deploy time, staff time, to making all of that work really well, I think. And the second thing that point that you're making about getting away from the old caricature of school is how vital the school as an institution is in the attack on lack of equity. Because for maybe, I don't know what proportion, but different communities, of course, but for some kids, it is their opening to possibility from circumstances which are hugely constrained, hugely impoverished. That was the great gift of mass schooling that came about in the early 19th century, that, you know, it liberated. I mean, I am a product of that, from a working class environment, which was incredibly restricted. You know, I hadn't been anywhere, I hadn't done anything. In my house, there was not a book. People say to me, yeah, that'd be ridiculous, of course. No, I'm sorry, there was not a book. They got a sort of a rag of a newspaper. But until I went to school, I didn't see books. So I know what I'm talking about here. And for many kids, the school is the absolute opening up of possibility. And we must not lose sight of that. And my fear about notions of technology being the solution and personalized, by which is usually meant individualized, you know, communing with a screen, means that you lose that capacity of schools to be a huge part of liberation for many groups of kids. So Rogan, I couldn't agree with you more about that. And those are the pieces that we need to be developing very explicitly, I think.
Sue here, just along those lines, when we started closing our schools down or giving students that option of being at home and families, and I'm in a town, we have a lot of very vulnerable students, and some of our most vulnerable were the ones that actually attended more regularly than they've ever attended before. And there were some moments when I was moving around the school, some quite moving moments where I'd go into a classroom and there'd be a lad who was reading to a teacher or being read to, who had, you know, probably not had a full week at school but was coming every single day.
Right.
And some students that were part of a program, CONTAF, which is a program supporting young Aboriginal lads here. And I'd worried that we'd got them attending, but I thought once school stops, they won't keep coming, but they did. And I think for us too, we were grateful to have the students here, because I look just back at my notes, you talk about the relationship making. And I think we were all at school and we were feeling a bit lost because we didn't have our students. And then some of those that were here actually helped us navigate our way through what was happening. And on the last day before the holidays, we actually all got together outside, social distancing, but we had a morning tea to thank them for how they had helped us work out what was important and what we needed to do. And it was interesting because they were the ones that we were having the sleepless nights about in terms of what was going to happen. So I thought, just reflecting on that, and, you know, when you were talking about the relationship making and school still being that, you know, the place for connecting all the dots.
How are you going to build on that then, in terms of the insights that you've developed as a result? As you reflect back on what happened there, does that lead you to think about how you might change or evolve any of your programs or your approaches as a result?
Yes, I think, and certainly don't have the answers now, but I think it's something that teachers have commented on, and now that we've got more opportunity to be face-to-face, I think too, we're starting to have some of those conversations about, you know, where to from here. We've also been part of a trauma-aware education program, the Berry Street model here as well, and one of the things they talk about is, you know, in schools, all you've really got is the story and the relationship. And then if you haven't got that, then the content, you know, the Australian curriculum, whatever, it's not going to happen. And so that has actually helped us. I think that's made the connections with that learning for us a lot stronger. And so how can we capitalise on that sort of environment where students are able to sit with a teacher and read and learn and
relate.
And I guess that, you know, that's the stuff we've called intervention before, but I don't think it needs to be intervention anymore. I think it's a way of operating.
Exactly. How interesting. Intervention in this sort of assembly line approach, you know, and intervene. Whereas actually what you're saying is it's about those relationships. It's about something which is continuous and flowing. But what you're talking about there is precisely the construction of the third horizon. So starting to have those conversations. And I suppose what I'm saying is that you as leaders need to hang on to the, you know, the kind of building on insights, the experiential insights that people have had. Because snapping back will happen. But if you can hang on to the insights that people have started to have in their own lived experience and build upon those in the conversations that you engineer as a part of your development of your narrative, then you will be moving to something which I think is potentially really powerful, actually. So that was really interesting. Thank you. How are we doing for time? I don't know the time.
Oh, we've gone 15 minutes.
Can I?
Over, in fact, probably half an hour for you, Valerie. So do you want to take some more?
Can I ask something? Oh.
Sorry, I was just asking.
Can I ask something, Valerie?
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
Yep. Some of the people in the room would be aware that some of the schools are involved in the learner profile research that we're doing with the University of Melbourne. And what struck me over the last few weeks is the importance of this work, the greater importance of this work, because it's looking at the assessment of the capabilities or competencies, as our University of Melbourne colleagues call them. And I'm just quite concerned that with this recession coming upon us, these skills that the students develop that now can be recognised in this learner profile type approach, how do we actually ensure that the community supports this move so that we move beyond the HR and we do actually value these competencies or capabilities as equal to grades? Or can we actually get rid of grades, which would be my preferred option, but that's another story. So I'm just interested in what you think about the notion of measuring what matters and how we move that forward in our society.
Well, it's a big one, and I think it'll be different for different parts of the society. I mean, I think that the teachers' organisations, the principals' organisations, the voice of the profession has to be heard loud and clear now, and engineering dialogues with, you know, the employers, organisations, wherever civil society sort of comes together to articulate what is important about shifting away from grades to something which is much more meaningful. And I think the direction of argument is obvious. I mean, you've indicated it yourself, really, that more meaningful means of assessing and recording and credentialing will be far more valuable to every aspect of society, not just better for learning communities, but better for employers in terms of their understanding what they need and might get, better for every aspect of civil society, actually. So it's about, I suppose, creating that case and articulating it in all the spaces that can be done, whether that's on, you know, blogs, whether that's in newspaper articles. I mean, I think we've got to be much more kind of outward facing as a profession and engage with, you know, evil giants like the media. I mean, the media coverage of education is pathetic, isn't it? I mean, it's just truly superficial and dire. And I hold my hand up to this. I mean, I've tried and failed tragically to try to engage with media who, after all, kind of represents what's going on and give just such impoverished pictures. I mean, and coming back to, I forget whose point, was it Jason's point about the kind of image that people have of schools and classrooms. So we've got to do a lot more, I think, to create a better narrative. Sorry, you know, and that will partly be perhaps less about technical and statistical evidence and more about stories about why assessing in a different way is infinitely more powerful and useful. I've got to say, you've got a really, really impressive whiteboard behind you. I don't know what it is, but it's so impressive. Hi. I have just realised that I've got another meeting, not one of which I'm presenting, I'm glad to say, in 10 minutes' time. So I'm very happy to continue the conversation, but I'm going to have to log off in about 5 minutes to go and get my head in gear to meet with some other people. But Jane, in your hands as to how to manage it.
Thank you, Valerie. That's very generous of you to offer another 5 minutes of your time.
No problem. I'm enjoying the conversation. I thought there were some really interesting points.
Yeah, it's been fantastic. So I really would just like to ask if there's anyone else who would like to share something for the last 5 minutes. Peter Philp, Peter, would you introduce yourself to Valerie as well?
Yeah, Peter Philp. I'm from Kangaroo Island Community Education on Kangaroo Island.
Right.
Yes, head of Kingsgate Campus.
Sorry, I missed it at the beginning. Did you say Kangaroo Island?
Yes.
So you were devastated by fire as well earlier in the year.
Yeah, we've had, you know, lots of the discussion tonight. You know, you talk about change and change of values and people being tested, seeing people work in teams. That's been with us since January in a big way. Yeah, so, you know, we've had a lot of challenges, and I think right from the start of the year with those bushfires, people mightn't be in leadership positions in the school, but they emerge as leaders. And I think COVID has done that as well. I think COVID did two things. You've talked about how you see the team players. COVID also exposed, for want of a better word, those teachers that perhaps biding their time really don't want to have much to do with change. And this was very threatening to them. Yeah. And maybe it is their time. Maybe that they have really thought about where they are at in their careers. But it also, at the other end, it really showed people really stepped up as leaders that aren't in leadership positions, but they thrive on that. And you know, when we talk about leadership, you don't have to have the title to be a leader, and that's part of that team player. And I think that really came through. What I was going to say was, in that, Horizon 3 we're talking about, and we've talked about, you know, we community teachers need to do this, really grab hold of that. And I think it's really, really important because that students have a powerful voice in that Horizon 3, and we get their input and feedback because their values have changed too, I think. Their values of school, their values, hopefully respect of teachers has increased, that relationship, teacher-student relationship, and you know, where you have tragedy, you have opportunity. You know, we've got students on some very powerful groups at the moment in the bushfire recovery process, but there's also, you know, same opportunity with the COVID to have students have their voice. And we started doing a lot of surveying, getting feedback from students. What do they want us to keep? What do they think worked well? What are the good values and things like that? Yeah, so I think students are really important part of Horizon 3.
Definitely. Thank you so much. And, you know, had it not been with the shortage of time, I would perhaps have majored on that. How do we bring students into the conversation, the narrative creation, as they're not just sort of sitting back to be broadcast to, but actually creating the narratives themselves from their experience and from their shifting values. Everything you said, Peter, I think is really, really important and valuable. Thank you. So I'm hoping to see schools finding ever more interesting and authentic ways to involve students and learners in that whole process. Because like you say, some of it can be pretty superficial and tokenistic, but it can also be profoundly meaningful and impactful, and all the better for it. Thank you. I really am going to have to go, I've realised, so I'm sorry if I've talked too long, but I very much enjoyed our conversation, so thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much for your time, Valerie. We are really looking forward to working with you in the future, and hopefully we can do that in 2021.
That would be
please
lovely.
Please take very good care of yourself.
Well, my intention is to try not to catch it, you know, God willing, but who knows. Any case, bye everybody, and thank you again.
Okay. Bye, Valerie. Thank you.
Oh, I'm worried that I'm the host. If I go, I'll lose you. You are all stuffed.
Yeah.
Assign a new host.
Don't end the meeting, Valerie.
No, right. Okay.
Just leave the meeting
I'll assign.
rather than end